Welcome to the BreakPoint podcast and our Q&A segment, Ask the Colson Center. I'm Shane Morris, and I'm here with John Stonestreet to answer your questions. These questions are based on BreakPoint commentaries and podcasts we've aired, short courses that we've held, and articles and columns we've posted lately. If you want to submit your question, you can email us at askthecolsoncenter@colsoncenter.org. John, I want to start us off with a question of my own here, and it has to do with the every square inch thing that we quote all the time from Kuyper. And if it's true that we talk about every square inch here at the Colson Center, I think we ought to be talking about the best Christmas movies. What qualifies as a Christmas movie, first of all, and then what is our favorite Christmas movie? Because there's some debate about some of them that are popularly accepted in the Christmas canon, like, for instance, Die Hard, and Harry Potter is another one that we're not quite sure whether that fits in there.
And I think there's one that gets forgotten in this whole debate, which is it's a crucial decision, whether Gremlins is a Christmas movie.
What? Gremlins?
It takes place at Christmas. The original Gizmo Mogwai was a Christmas gift. There's Christmas songs. There's Christmas decorations throughout the whole thing. There's a Christmas soundtrack to it. So, it just gets overlooked. One of the great moments in all of cinema. I actually watched it the other night with my kids for the first time in a long, long time.
Wow. Okay.
That was awful. It's such a terrible movie at every level. My kids were looking at me like, what on earth are we doing here? And I'm like, yeah, I really don't know. I just thought about it and thought, we should watch it.
Then there are the greats that must always make the list, like Home Alone, the first one, apparently, not the second one where Trump makes a cameo. Elf.
Now the second one, I like the second one.
You like the second one? I had an argument with someone on Facebook recently about whether the second one was worthy of as a sequel.
Right. Well, he wasn't home, right? So it's not. Right. It's a misleading title. But I think the creativity of the second one's really, really good. I think that I have watched just recently. I'm kind of embarrassed. I've been stuck at home with my family. We've had to quarantine again for kind of a second round. So we watched Home Alone 3, which did you know there was a Home Alone 3 in the canon?
It's not Kevin though, right? It's not Macaulay Culkin.
No, it's not. It's not. But at this point, what's the guy's name? Macaulay Culkin.
Right. Macaulay Culkin
had entered his awkward teenage Hollywood years.
Let's just say he lost the adorable factor.
He lost the adorable factor on a number of levels. And so there's this other kid, and who's in this one though is Scarlett Johansson, who's like 12. Who's like 12? She's like 12. She's in Home Alone 3, which is home, right? It happens at home, but it has to do with international terrorists looking for a missile defense or a missile guidance that gets stuck in a toy that ends up at this boy's house. And I don't know who the boy is. And so he gets super creative on this, again, and beats up the bad guys by himself because the adults won't believe him. And people miss, look, people are like, what are we talking about here? I'm going to give you the worldview analysis, because Gremlins and Home Alones, including Home Alone 3 especially, and almost every 80s movie was existentialist. In other words, authority figures like adults. You might remember that famous scene in E.T. where the bad guys have the keys. Like anybody with the keys, anybody with authority are the people trying to hold us down. And of course, it usually expresses itself in teenagers will save the world, or pre-teenagers will save the world.
Right.
When they just they don't let anyone tell them what to do. They live out their own meaning and purpose. This was the whole genre. Back to the Future, Ferris Bueller's Day Off. We can go through in this golden age of cinema, the 80s, of how existentialism dominated Steven Spielberg.
And now we're back to that with, Stranger Things and kids just doing whatever the heck they want, regardless of what their parents think. And
Stranger Things is
they end up letting in stuff from monsters from another dimension. So it's right in line with the genre. Well, in line with what we're talking about here, Christmas traditions. One of them is, of course, movies, but there are a lot older traditions. And one of the things that we hear, I think I hear every year from two different directions, is this: that Christmas is a pagan holiday. And what people usually mean by that is either what a lot of real conservative Christian critics of the holiday will mean, which is that, a lot of pagan traditions have sort of leaked in over the years, and now we celebrate this holiday that's more about trees and pre-Christian traditions, and then a bunch of commercialism than it is about Christ. In the other direction, John, is the atheist attack on Christmas, where they say that, well, you guys think you're celebrating the birth of Christ, but really what you're doing is celebrating this dressed up pagan festival that predates Christianity, whether it's the Saturnalia or Sol Invictus, or perhaps even a pagan god like Horus or Krishna or Mithras. And these charges are leveled by all kinds of guys, like Bill Maher, for instance, had them in a documentary years ago called Religulous. That's clever, right? And he just makes the claim that Egyptian mythology has blatant Christ figures whom the early Christians just copied lock, stock, and barrel to write the story of Christ. Let's talk about that, because I think that's a question that comes up a lot, and we've actually got a number of resources coming out about that shortly, including a BreakPoint and What Would You Say video.
Yeah, today's BreakPoint actually deals with this and is really telling the story of a conversation that you had with Dr. Glenn Sunshine, a longtime friend and kind of go-to church historian for the Colson Center. And also What Would You Say video, which of course our What Would You Say videos is a new series of videos. Well, I say new, they're about a year old now, where each week we've posted a video on YouTube. So far, we're pushing 2 million views and 27,000 or so subscribers to these videos. Some are using them in small groups and churches and so on. We've done them on kind of controversial issues like critical race theory, a big topic midway through the year, as well as, issues having to do with abortion or the gender issues and so on. And this might be our most controversial yet. Was Christmas a pagan holiday? But I want to start here. You spent a lot of more time talking about this. I want to punt it to you on the actual details because you spent a lot of time looking at this lately. But I want to start with this question. So what if it is? If it is, let's say that all the accusations of Bill Maher and Christians who are really concerned about doing the right thing. And by the way, I always want to acknowledge the fact that Christians who are have strong convictions. You kind of like the number of Christians that don't have strong convictions or won't stand for strong convictions. You want to respect anyone who does and will, at some level. But let's just say that all the accusations about what Christmas is, the trappings around the trees and the dates and the lights and everything else, whether or not it copies paganism or whatever. Let's say that is true. And I want to bring up a theological concept that St. Augustine famously called spoiling the Egyptians, which is, and obviously he's theologically applying a narrative from when the Israelites are freed from Egypt, and God basically says, hey, go to your neighbors and ask for all their stuff. and the neighbors, of course, are petrified because of all the plagues. And they're like, sure, here's our gold. And basically without, killing a single person, God, by the way, killed some people, but without the Israelites killing a single person, they completely loot the place, right? And it's how they fund this 40-year journey that's going to take them to get to the promised land. Now, what Augustine does is says, look, if it's good enough, if there are created goods that are good enough for the Egyptians, they're good enough for the Israelites.
Right.
Another way to say this is where Scripture says every good and perfect gift comes from above. Another way to say this is all truth is God's truth. In other words, because God is the creator of all things, when he created the world, he looked at all that he had made and said it is good. After creating man and woman, he said it is very good. Because of all that, then when and we're made in God's image, and so there is an ability of human beings to access this truth and then to discover it, not only to discover it, but then to turn around and articulate it and maybe even use it to do things like fly and drive and combust engines and all kinds of things. Then the idea here is that it is completely acceptable because of this view of creation to say, look, very good things still exist in the world. And when Christians can take them and Christianize them, it's actually an act of restoration. Our friend Glenn Sunshine, I don't know if he got into this in your conversation. But our logo, which if people are watching this on YouTube or they're watching this on Facebook, as opposed to just listening to it on radio or on our podcast, right
should
above
appear
my
somewhere
head.
down here or okay, up there.
Yeah, right above my head, right?
Oh, the real one in your office.
There,
Yeah, right.
that logo. That's our logo
go.
for the Colson Center, right? You can kind of see it on our website if you go to colsoncenter.org. It looks like an inverted dinner plate right above my head right now.
What does that have on it?
Colson Center, right there.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean,
the logo is basically a artistically rendered version of the Irish cross, which was used in paganism until St. Patrick saved the world, right? The Irish saved civilization, until Christians came and basically spoiled the Egyptians. In this case, spoiled pagan Irish or ancient Irish, sorts of religions, because they looked at this and what the pagans thought that this symbol illustrated. The Christians obviously saw the cross, then they saw the connection. They saw a way to illustrate the lordship of Christ over all of creation, a way to hold together the seasons, a way to hold together the directions, a way to hold together the hemispheres. And they saw this as a way basically of symbolizing Colossians chapter 1 right here. Right.
Yeah.
And I think it's a theologically sound idea if you believe that Christianity is not just a belief of Christians, it's a belief that is true about life in the world. It actually is a way of accessing reality and truth. And so if it does not lead us into sin, and it can be Christianized and restored, and we can burn off the dross, to use Paul's language, and hold on to what is holy and true and good and of precious metal, then it's absolutely, and I would make that argument when it comes to, even if all these accusations of Christmas being pagan is true, hey, let's spoil the Egyptians. Christians have done that for a long time, and it's given us a lot of ways to celebrate Christ, to exalt his lordship, and to communicate to a lost world.
Well, I love that point, John. And it sounds like to me you're pointing to the fact that the Celtic cross as a symbol in some ways does predate Christianity, where there's this cross. I don't know if it maybe is equilateral as opposed to the typical, top crossbar with the Christian cross. But that symbol is something that Christians came along and saw and said, hey, that kind of looks like the cross. We're going to make our own thing out of that in Celtic Christianity. And the funny part is the same thing is true of the original symbol. I was asking you, what's behind you there? Well, it's the cross on the logo, and it's a stylized Celtic cross. But the point is the cross itself, as I talked about with Tom Holland in our interview on the BreakPoint podcast, which we're re-airing on Upstream this week. The cross originated as a symbol of terror and repression. The Roman Empire used crosses, and before them the Persians, to instill terror in the hearts of their subjects. And what did Christ do to the cross? Well, he did a lot more than die on one. He transformed the symbol itself. He transformed death itself into this symbol of hope and restoration and salvation and atonement. And now the cross sits above hospitals. It sits on the logos of ministries like ours. It stands on the steeples of churches, announcing salvation and new hope. Christians have been plundering the Egyptians since the very beginning. We plundered the cross itself, and I think that's such an important point. Even after we've done the arguments for how these traditions actually originated, because it turns out December 25th almost certainly was not chosen as the date of Christ's birth to coincide with a Roman festival. It was probably due to Jewish reasoning about when people are conceived and when they die. And Dr. Sunshine talks about that in our podcast. It turns out that the Christmas tree, for instance, probably was not, there's no solid evidence that this thing came from some sort of pagan festival. Most likely it came from medieval mystery plays and was a stand-in for the tree of life, which is why we put all those baubles and things on them that kind of look like fruits. There are, plausible origin stories for many of these traditions. And obviously Christmas trees are not as essential to Christmas as, a creche would be, as a manger scene, as the commemoration of what it's actually about. But your point is key, John, is that just because some pagans in ages past used pine trees in their worship doesn't mean that we can't use them, because they belong to Christ. He created them. He likes pine trees, to borrow a line from Lewis. And so there's nothing wrong at all with our using these symbols, but it goes deeper than that. And in my conversation with Glenn, I won't spoil it for everyone, but in my conversation with Glenn, he makes the claim that all of reality for Christians should be sacramental in a way, or at least sacral, where when we look at the seasons, when we look at the rising and setting of the sun, when we look at our sleep habits, when we look at the way the light decreases down to the winter solstice and then reverses and begins increasing, and the nights start getting shorter again, all of these things he believes are, aspects of God's world that he intended us to read and to appropriate and to use as symbols for making sense of the story of redemption. They're revelation. I mean, we confess that as Christians. We have long confessed that God's general revelation includes all that he has built into creation. And we can see those instructions, those messages in just the way it's designed. So it's a really good conversation. The What Would You Say video is based on a lot of that same material. And I just watched it for the first time last night. I was really happy with it. So we'll link that on breakpoint.org. You guys can check that out. Check out my podcast with Dr. Glenn Sunshine. And I hope it's really helpful for you, whether you're responding to, Christians who have misgivings about Christmas, or just atheist trolls like Bill Maher who want to, who want to snow on our parade.
But let me just close with the most important final thought, and that is Mary did know. Mary absolutely knew.
We go through this every year. You don't like rhetorical questions. It's not a real question.
I just don't like that rhetorical question, because she sang about it and it was great, and it's better theology than Mark Lowry. And I say that knowing my dad's going to be grumpy about it because he really likes that song too.
Yes, so. Hope he's listening.
And it's okay to like a song that you disagree with, right? We could spend all kinds of time talking about Turn Your Eyes Upon Jesus. All right.
Or why you love Imagine by John Lennon, right?
I look, for the record, I would not put Mary Did You Know in the same category as Imagine with John Lennon.
Oh, so. real quick, John, what's the worst Christmas song ever written? Because I know you have a couple that you just hate.
Oh yeah, we haven't done this. Well, look, I have this. I'm hoping one of my good friends from Chicago is listening, because every time since we did a Breakpoint last year and mentioned Santa Baby, whenever he is driving in his truck in December and it comes on, he takes a picture of his XM radio screen. But listen, it's not only whenever it's Santa Baby, it's worse than that. It's when it's Santa Baby by Madonna. I mean, could there be you
feel like you have to take a shower after you hear that one.
I feel like it when I get the picture from this guy, just looking at it, remembering that it is. I used to think it was that John Lennon and Yoko Ono song. So This Is Christmas, right? I used to think that was the worst of all time, which is saying a lot because Santa Baby is so sketchy. Baby, It's Cold Outside obviously fails the test of the Me Too movement. You've got, Do They Know It's Christmas Time at All? Singing about the place where, the first Christians were. They're quite aware. And so I thought all of that one,
Augustine's
and then I tweeted last year.
We know it's Christmas in Africa.
Yeah. They're really clear. They're really clear that it's Christmas in Africa. But I used to think the Yoko Ono John Lennon song was as bad as it could get, and then Train came out with a Christmas song last year.
Yes.
And the meme is hey, John Lennon saying, hey, I can write the worst Christmas song ever, and then Train says, here, hold my beer. And,
hold my eggnog.
Hold my eggnog. There we go. That's a much better line. But and I can't even remember what it is, but I heard it last year, and it is worse than Home Alone 3. Here it is, full lyrics. Ho, 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 shake up the happiness, wake up the happiness, shake up the happiness. There's a story that I was told, and I want to tell the world before I get too old. And don't remember it, so let's December it and reassemble it. Oh, yeah.
That's profound.
Once upon a time in a town like this, a little girl made a great big wish to fill the world full of happiness and be on Santa's magic list. So shake it up. Shake up the happiness. Wake it up. Wake up the happiness. Come on, y'all. It's Christmas time. Shake it up. Wake it up. Come on, y'all. And then it gets worse.
I'm in the spirit now.
I know you're out there. I hear your reindeer. I see the snow where your boots have been. I mean, it's painful. It's obvious. And of course, in typical Train-like fashion, they're way too excited about it as they sing it.
I don't have anything. I don't have any joke to say to that.
Let's move on.
It's really awful. It truly is. There's
No,
nothing else
it's
to say.
as bad as it gets. I mean, I heard it and I was like, I didn't think anybody would actually. Yeah, I don't even know what to say. It's awful.
John. Well, we'll make sure somebody writes a Christmas song praising the TSA at some point, just so we can, top that one.
Is there a COVID Christmas song? I have seen some funny memes where, COVID Christmas, let's, having to do with let's not get together.
I'm sure there are.
We have gotten a ton of comments from listeners over the last couple of weeks, which is great, which we love. And part of it has to do with writing about things that are very either controversial or right now it's certainly politically divided. And we address something that we have addressed throughout the Trump administration. One of the things we've tried to do is not be partisan. When Trump has done something worthy of praise, we have tried to say that. When his administration has done things that has not been worthy of praise, we've tried to say that. And one of the things that we have wrestled with is the fact that he's been his administration has done an awful lot for religious liberty internationally. The ministerial that was held twice, I think now, international conference, even in the midst of COVID, advancing religious liberty, finally really not only naming Sam Brown back to the ambassadorial role, which it took the Obama administration years and years to actually fill that role, if they ever did, and then it didn't go anywhere. But really, Brownback has been empowered as the ambassador for international religious freedom, and Secretary Pompeo has been very supportive of this as well. And of course, they've weighed in on religious liberty issues at the Supreme Court for domestic issues. But we have talked about the fact that under the Trump administration, the number of refugees that have been led into the United States has not only shrunk, it has basically closed up to less than 25,000 a year at a time where, as we often talk about this as kind of key issues that Christians need to care about, is the persecution of religious minorities, especially Christians. The worst year on record is 2019, and the worst year on record before that is 2018, and the worst year on record before that is 2017. And this has been the record for 8 or 9 years, where international religious liberty, the state of international religious liberty, has gotten worse. The amount of religious persecution has dramatically increased. Now, we talked about, for example, China treating Muslim Uyghurs essentially like the Nazis treated the Jews during the Holocaust. But we can just actually focus in on Christian persecution for our brothers and sisters, and it's awful. And so, what we talked about is the Vice President Biden, probably the President-elect Biden. It's hard to know when to use that term correctly. But Joe Biden announced that he was going to reverse that and take it back to Obama-era policies. And what we talked about was, look, on BreakPoint, and we got a lot of negative feedback on that. We got a lot of negative and positive feedback. One of my dear friends who has just finished our Colson Fellows program, who works internationally in missions, called and thanked us for saying something about this, that the Trump administration has done really, I think, very good things for international religious liberty, for the protection and advancement, mentioning religious persecution around the world from the bully pulpit, so to speak. But what hasn't been a part of it is allowing refugees into the United States. And this was actually something that was part of their campaign promises. Vice President Pence in particular said something, and it's just an area that they haven't followed through. Mm-hmm. And part of the reason is, as we said on BreakPoint, is that the refugee issue gets confused with the larger immigration issue.
Yeah.
And that's a lot of the feedback we got was, in my opinion, continuing to confuse those two issues.
Let me read a comment that we got in response to that, where I think that sort of confusion is taking place. This person writes in, the question that I have is in terms of balance. Just like individuals, there is only so much that a nation can do. If any individual tried to meet all of the needs around them, they themselves would quickly fall apart. Even during his time on earth, Jesus did not heal everyone. On one extreme, we do not take anyone and let everyone fend for themselves. On the other extreme, we take in everyone, so the population of the U.S. goes from around 330 million to 2 billion, which destroys our country. I wish you all had more clearly addressed this point.
Yeah, and look, that's the challenge of doing, which we always face, doing a 4.5 minute or 3.5 minute commentary for radio, and I cheat, and it gets way longer than that for the podcast. But you can't say everything, but the one thing that we said is that what the policy that Biden has announced that he will pursue is going back to Obama era policies, which had to do with it, basically having a quota of 125,000 refugees that they let in each year. The problem, and by the way, at no point in the commentary did we ever say that the answer to Trump's policy mistake is Obama's policy mistake. Obama made a policy mistake in two ways. Number one is setting a quota as opposed to responding to the level of resources that we do have and the need that's out there, which is the math that needs to be brought into this. And number two is because President Obama, particularly during his second term, made LGBT issues the key issue around all domestic and foreign policy, that to say I'm a homosexual puts you at the front of the line for being relocated, not having to do with kind of systemic persecution, the emptying out of the church in Iraq and Syria and so on. So there was a real problem for how this was done. The answer is not, and I just want to say it definitively. And the point I wish I had said more definitively in the commentary was, I'm not saying Obama era policy on refugees was the right one. It wasn't, because like everything he did, especially during his second term, it was driven by the new sexual ideology and the new sexual orthodoxy. That's not helpful. However, there is to say that there's two extremes is true. There's an extreme, don't take anyone in. There's another extreme, let everybody in. There's a whole lot of ground in the middle. Yeah. And the ground in the middle is where we failed. In other words, we have the resources to take in far more than 25,000. There were particular hotspots that exploded in the last 4 years that needed to be cared about and needed to be looked about, and that brought it in. And by the way, as we said in the commentary very clearly, letting people into the United States is not the only way to solve the refugee issue around the world. And the Trump administration did a lot of things other than let people into the United States, but more people need to be let into the United States. And this gives the church an opportunity to act. And this also, and this was another complaint that we got, is, this is the church's job, not the government's job. True. But in this case, the church can't do its full job here without the government doing its job and letting more people in. There's I don't want to say a balance to be struck, because that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying there's a better path forward in which, and I think that people doing foreign policy in the Trump administration, they confuse the refugee issue with the immigration issue. Like, I'm fully aware that the crisis on the southern border that was in the last years of the Obama administration, the early days of the Trump administration, that people pouring across, our inability to vet people coming in across the southern border, all of this created that panic, which is like, look, we got to stop this until we can deal with it. Fine, deal with that. When we're talking about refugees from Syria, from the Middle East, from China, from Iran, and the list goes on and on and on, that's not the same problem. This isn't the same thing to be dealt with. This isn't the same issue to be dealt with the same way as the immigration problem on the southern border. That's a different issue. And these things have all got conflated into the minds of people. And so when you say something like, look, we need to do more for settling refugees that are being run away from their home, and we have the ability to vet them, we can improve them, we can turn our resources and focus in on those that are in the hottest areas and in need of the greatest relief. And we can bring the whole toolkit, not just basically opening up and allowing people in. In other words, there's a lot that can be done. And that was the main point, is let's do this better.
We not only have to distinguish, between the refugee crisis and the immigration issue writ large, John, but we also have to, I think, distinguish between the roles of government and church here. And I do appreciate the response that we got from a number of listeners that, well, this is the job of the church, right? When God gives the instructions in Deuteronomy, for example, and Numbers regarding hospitality to the sojourner, to strangers in the land of in the promised land in Canaan. Those correspond more to his instructions to the church than they do to the government. But the thing is, though, that Israel, under the divine theocracy, under God's tutelage, was a nation as well as a church polity, as well as a covenant people. And as such, much of what God did and instructed them to do as a nation has broad applicability to what justice looks like between nations, to what good government looks like. And peoples, just like individuals, are called to be good neighbors. And of course, the answer to the question of who is my neighbor is pretty clear in the Gospels. It's the one who needs you right now, the one you encounter on the road who's in trouble. And so there has to be a balance. Obviously, the United States can't solve the problems of everyone in the world, but I think there's a lot of room historically, looking at the number of refugees we used to take in versus now. It's a precipitous drop. It's incredible. Historically, there's proof that the United States could show a lot more mercy and aid to people who just need a place to go because they're absolutely unsafe in their home countries. I mean, back when ISIS was at its height, we saw whole communities completely extirpated or driven out of their homes, and then just living in refugee camps, just stuck in camps for months and months on end. A lot of these people are prime candidates for help from the United States, and it would be a big mistake, I think, for Christians to sit on our hands and say, well, we can't solve everyone's problems, and besides, we have our own stuff to deal with here domestically. I saw that theme a lot in the responses, and I don't think
it's true. We do,
but it's not a choice. It's not a dichotomy between the
two. In so many ways, this falls into the look. We can't just go off talking points or headlines. We have to look, beyond that. We have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. Like, look, I'm a political conservative. I try to make sure that it lines up with the Christian worldview. I'm sure sometimes the cart drives the horse, or vice versa, and we can constantly want to reevaluate that. But we can say, look, a nation should have very strong borders. A nation should vet everybody that comes in. A nation should understand, have situational awareness, right? And since 9/11, we have a elevated situational awareness that we weren't paying attention to, and we need to be paying attention to it more. All of those things are true, and we can still say, you know what? We need to allow more Christian, especially Christian refugees. And I'll say that I'll get hammered from the other side for saying that, it's easier to, I remember, I think it was, there was a great apologist once that was talking to an atheist, and the atheist was like, you don't need Christianity, to justify religion. And he said, look, if you were walking down a street at night and a bunch of big burly guys are headed your way, and with hoodies on, would it help you to know that they're coming from a Bible study? And it was such a great illustration. And I think the same thing is true here. Look, part of this is vetting. Yeah. Does it help us to know that these people are identifying as are Christians as opposed to not? Yeah, exactly. And does it mean we shouldn't look after Muslim refugees or atheist refugees or whatever else? It just means that we can do a better job. In other words, the vetting is possible. It's there. I appreciated the concern saying, look, we're not taking care of our own people, adequately, especially in the middle of a pandemic. I do think the pandemic question, that pandemic question complicates all this. No question whatsoever. But these numbers,
everything. It complicates getting lunch.
That's right. It certainly complicated my household for the last couple of weeks, but the basically turning off the spigot in terms of how many refugees we're allowing into the country, that predates COVID. This isn't a COVID reality. This is it got worse this year, but certainly, but it's a pre-COVID thing, and it can be fixed. And I'll say it again, to say that Trump didn't handle this well. It's not to say that he didn't champion religious liberty, to say that in many other ways, to say that Trump didn't handle this well. And by Trump, I mean the administration. I'm not sure how much he had hands on in all this, but his people did. And to say that the administration didn't handle this well is not to say we should go to Obama era policies. And I think we saw in the nomination this week to the head of HHS, which is something we'll talk about at the end of the week and BreakPoint this week, is the Attorney General from California, Becerra, being tapped to lead HHS. There's some good reason to think we're going back to Obama era policy on a whole lot of appointments and non-elected positions and policy initiatives. So that's all legitimate concerns. And I did appreciate that feedback on this.
I hope you also appreciate me diving into the heat you got for this commentary and joining you and responding to it, because I didn't co-author this one. I didn't help write this one, but it's good. You made some great points there in the commentary and in the response. And I hope that it helps out a lot of our listeners. We got time for one more thing here that we talked about before the show. We wanted to hit, and it was a response we received to another one of our recent commentaries on atheist Jerry Coyne, who runs the Why Evolution is True blog based on his 2009, I think it was, book, and determinism, which is the idea that basically everything is cause and effect in the universe. And theoretically, if you knew the initial conditions after the Big Bang, you could predict everything that would ever unfold, including human choices. So the question is there free will? Are choices real in the universe? Okay, this listener responds from something of a theological perspective to what was in the commentary more of a scientific and philosophical question. So I'll just read this. This article mirrors some thoughts I've been pondering for a couple of years. I believe God determines all things. The gospel seems to agree with my assessment. Therefore, Mr. Coyne may not be that far off in reality, except his worldview is not Christ-centered based on his beliefs. Would God not also know the outcomes of these quantum events or determine them? There can be no random acts in God's universe, as far as I know. Would God not also know every event in your life and mine? I personally struggle with a belief in free will, unless God gives it to us at redemption. If the prophets could give us so many revelations of future events, then is this not determined outcomes? I must admit, I trust no conclusions I make unless they are confirmed by the facts. Neither idea in this article is supported by fact in my mind. Let me take a quick stab at this, John. So this person sounds like he or she is coming from, and I didn't catch the name, so I'm not sure, man or woman, is coming from a similar perspective to me, which is the Reformed Calvinistic perspective. We do call ourselves determinist in a theological sense. And we also call ourselves compatibilist, which means that we think that true freedom, culpable moral freedom, can coexist in a universe in which God ordains all events. And that's a little complicated, but see the Westminster Confession for more details on secondary causation and all that. The point is that determinism, as we talked about it in relation to Jerry Coyne and the materialist worldview, is very different from this theological determinism, where God can ordain all things. But if we're talking about a mechanistic, clockwork universe where basically matter, atoms bumping into each other are the sole determining factor, that's absolutely right. That sort of thing is true determinism. It's utterly incompatible with free will. Jerry Coyne knows that, and many of his critics know it as well. He embraces it. The thing we pointed out in the commentary is that quantum physics is unlocking a new level of randomness at the base of all physical interactions. So it turns out that there is a level on which even physics is not determined by prior states, where there are truly random new configurations happening. And that definitely opens the door for a lot of philosophy to enter in, a lot of questions about, well, could the human brain actually be something more than a clockwork determined machine? I think that's a different question. And we did mention this in the commentary. That is a different question than the theological one about how God controls everything. What does his sovereignty look like? Does he influence the quarks and leptons and exactly how they come out, or what spin gets put on an electron? Yes, he does. I don't know that's how he influences or ordains what comes to pass, turns the heart of the king, as the scriptures put it. But so what do you think about this, John? I mean, how do we fit together this idea of theological sovereignty over all things with a critique of materialistic determinism?
You know, like so many things, I'm grateful for a set of categories that I first encountered in a book from Os Guinness called now it's been retitled The Last Christian on Earth. It's kind of a new take on the Screw Tape Letters, although he says it's not based after that, but it's basically the enemy camp trying to help subvert the power of Christianity, but it's describing it not in terms of kind of personal moral decisions like Screw Tape does, but in terms of the push towards modernism. And in that, he says, you know, Christians have failed to understand what's happening, to understand the times, as Second Chronicles puts it about the men of Issachar, because they have not understood the history of ideas. So to understand the distinction that Shane's making here, knowing the history of ideas is pretty important. The distinction between talking about determinism in theological categories and doing it in kind of cosmological categories, like Jerry Coyne does, is a very important distinction. And it has to do with this expectation coming out of the scientific revolution, going into the later 1800s, the power that Darwin gave, an explanatory power to create a completely new way of seeing life in the world that didn't require God, that allowed us to take God out of the realm of public truth and really push it into the realm of personal, private, imaginary friend, because we had a system that explained everything. And the power of science to explain was like a drug. I remember Friedrich Nietzsche wrote about this. Certainly Dostoevsky spends a lot of time on this in the Brothers Karamazov. Just the drug it is that we can figure so much out. Now think about that. The extent to which we have been able to explain the world that we have, and it makes sense in and of itself, although I think there are plenty of socks hanging outside the suitcase about design and things like that. But the power was huge, and it gave us not only an ability to understand the world, but to control it, to bring about the ends that we wanted. And so, but there was this tension that the world is a mechanistic place. Mechanism has to do with cause and effect. Like this thing happens, this thing necessarily happens. No one really chooses it. It's just the way that it is. And yet this was coming out of the human mind, which had this ability to actually understand for the first time. And so it was really powerful. But then this ability then to not only understand the world at this remarkable level, but to control the world, to get the ends that we want, to take women from being infertile to fertile, to take people from being grounded to being in flight. Amazing opportunities. And it also gave us the ability to look at the universe closer and closer and closer and closer. And suddenly our ability to explain and know led us to quantum physics.
Right.
And we look under the curtain, so to speak, at the guy, you know, the wizard behind the curtain, and there's not a wizard there. Like, it's crazy.
Yeah.
And yet we can still do all of this confident prediction on the surface, like we always have been able, since we've been able to do in the last 100 years.
We can shoot a billiard ball at this particular angle. It's going to hit the other balls, and you can calculate exactly where everything is going to go. Doesn't work like that.
And the Japanese can develop robots that can beat us in billiards because of that, right? I mean, these are really great YouTube videos, by the way. Like, you know, the bowling, you know, the bowling robot that gets a strike every time, so to speak. You know. So that is all based on our ability to absolutely understand and determine cause and effect. And yet you go that much deeper into the quantum realm and it's chaos, or it seems like chaos. Now, I think, by the way, God's up there going, ha, 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 you guys think you're so smart. Okay, that's my take on, you know, this modern project of being able to explain everything. That there's an epistemological humility that should come along with us being human, that we have a really hard time embracing. We have a hard time resisting this impulse that we are going to be able to fix everything, know everything, explain everything, and so on and so on and so on. So that's the historical backdrop of what we're dealing with here. Now let's go then. And by the way, the other thing that modernism does is it dismisses biblical revelation as a legitimate authority, right? As a legitimate source of knowledge. If you go back prior to modernism, lose that epistemological arrogance, And by the way, that's polysyllabic for the thing that this idea that we can know everything and explain everything is another way of saying epistemological arrogance. If we go back before that, before the modern period, and we re-embrace the Bible, the revelation, as being a legitimate source of knowledge, which Augustine and so many other people talked about, then it helps us kind of deal with also what does the Bible say then about this balance between God deciding things and the human free will.
Yeah.
And this is where I think it actually gets fun, and but it also is hard to grasp, which is the Bible is very, very comfortable in saying two things simultaneously. That ultimately the story of the world is written and told by God, and he not only started it, he's guiding it, he's intimately involved in it, and he's actually given us a glimpse of where it's going to go. So none of this is up in the air. This is what we call the story, capital S, out of the Colson Center. At the same time, part of this story is the image bearers, which operate, first of all, they have a special status in this story, and they have special abilities. They operate on different categories with different abilities than animals. We don't just consume, we create. We don't just take from the physical and created order. We actually innovate and imagine, and we imagine what's not there, and we have the ability to do this or not this. And in fact, the whole health of the cosmos is weighted on this. So when Adam decides then to use the moral freedom that God has created him with to violate God's law, the whole universe breaks. Yeah. And we have now a universe that's, as Neil Plantinga put it, not the way it's supposed to be. Now, did God know this was going to happen? Biblically, the answer, I think, is yes. Did God make Adam and Eve violate that command? The biblical answer is no. Right. In other words, God is very, very capable of maintaining human free will and the story not getting out of hand. Now, analogies are limited, okay? And we just, when we answered, was it last week we answered a question about the Trinity? When was that? Was that last week?
Yeah, I think that was last week, yes.
So somebody wrote us and was like, and it was a great email and saying, you need to warn people about using analogies. And they're right, because I used to 100%. Teach on the Trinity in theology class, and I at the college I taught at, and I would start the session going, guys, I just want to confess before everyone that sometime in the next 45 minutes, I will be a heretic. Yeah. Because I'm trying to explain something, and I think it was
until you've seen, you can't really talk on the Trinity until you've watched Lutheran Satire's Patrick's Bad Analogies video.
Yeah, look, the apple, the Father, man, all of those analogies make like you
water,
a heretic.
It can be
the water
solid,
one,
liquid, gas.
I think it was Millard Erickson that said, Millard Erickson said, look, we're about to take your shoes off because we're about to tread on holy ground, even talking about the Trinity. So the ability to explain it here is going to be limited. I think this falls into that category because we're trying to explain human dignity, not just human freedom, but human dignity, because that's connected in the biblical story with God's ultimate sovereignty, which is where the story, by the way, the story begins with God's sovereignty and ends with God the Son's sovereignty over all things. And so there you go. But let me give you an analogy, and I owe this to my friend, the late great Dr. Michael Bauman, one of the best classroom professors I ever saw in action. Taught for years at Hillsdale, passed away this past year. Just a great man, and he used to do a devil's advocate session with students on Calvinism and Arminianism, and it was just heads were exploding all over the place. He was just really great about it because he wanted to show the limitations of absolutism on both sides, and he did it really well. But here's what he said. He said, we have this tendency to think, look, either God's absent or God's a puppeteer, and we're marionettes, and he's pulling our strings, right? And he's like, but what if it's neither one of those things? What if it's that God is the director of a play, and he's really, really good as a director? In fact, he's so good that he allows the characters to ad-lib all they want. And yet, the play still comes out exactly as he intended. Now, can I give you a verse for that analogy? No, but it does seem to be the best analogy that I have heard.
You can come pretty close in Acts where, Peter says, in this city were gathered together, Herod and Pontius Pilate and the Jews, to do whatsoever his plan determined before, his hand determined beforehand would take place. And he's talking about the death of the Son of God on a cross.
That's pretty close.
That was the
That's
worst thing
actually
that
good.
ever happened, and yet he says God's hand determined that it would happen.
Yeah, yeah. I think this is where an Islamic view of the God sovereignty breaks down.
Yeah,
because it is so deterministic that it does compromise human freedom and therefore human guilt. And then makes God an arbitrary judge based on whatever he wants. In fact, if you get into fundamentalist Islam, have I done enough to merit paradise? The honest Muslim has to say, I don't know. In fact, Muhammad would have to say, I don't know, based on what they taught about who God is, that they didn't do enough. Even martyrdom isn't a guarantee. It just puts you in really good standing. That's very different than a Christian view in which human activity is acknowledged. The moral law that we are expected to know and to live by is a reflection of God's own character, not his arbitrary will.
Right.
And all these things play into it. And so, and by the way, we've done 2 kind of deep dives in theology the last couple of weeks. And I imagine some people are like, whoa, I hope it's you and I get super like nerdy excited over this, because it's real knowledge. This is one of the things I want to emphasize. This is real knowledge. And I hope the journey into real knowledge is itself worth the journey, even if you never quite feel like you've got it all figured out. Because look, you and I have worked really hard at this. You're in seminary right now, working really hard at this, trying to wrestle with this long conversation that goes way
literally
beyond
the subject of yesterday's class in systematic theology. Yes.
So here's the humility you and I need to have leaving this, but it's also really fun. My first theology prof, Gary Phillips, one of my heroes, said that our best theology is God's refrigerator art. We go to God with our really great colored pictures and like, look, Dad, I drew this for you. And you know what? I remember the first time I heard that, and then the first refrigerator art I got from my daughter,
You thought about it?
And I know you got some.
I'm worried about my kids' theology now, because my refrigerator art has prominently featured Baby Yoda recently, primarily. So I think they might be becoming Jedis.
Abigail, when she was like, I came home from a trip, and she was probably 3 or 4, and she's like, Dad, I drew you a picture. And I'd had enough nieces and nephews that I know that you never guess what's there.
Right.
Because you'll inevitably be wrong and they'll be deeply offended.
This beautiful, right? What is it?
Tell me about this. Yeah, tell me about what this is. And then it's like, oh, it's you. And I'm like, oh, I look like a troll. But you know what? Did I love it? Absolutely. Yes. Did I put it on the fridge? Absolutely. Because you love that your kid is doing this sort of thing with you in mind. And I think that's such a wonderful analogy. By the way, if anybody's thinking right now of a Snoodle's Tale by VeggieTales, there's a refrigerator art part of that, which you need to go look at. And it's a wonderful example of what we're trying to talk about, where somebody is trying to say, look, when humans get together, they're like, I am trying to come up with truth, and I'm doing it in light of my Father, my Heavenly Father, the creator of all things. And I'm going to do my best. And I mean, look, God must look at it and go, what the heck is this? But does he love it? Yes, because he's a loving Heavenly Father. And this is one of the distinctions between Christianity and Islam, is that he's a loving Heavenly Father that loves the fact that he has made the world knowable. He's revealed himself. He's made us knowers. And the journey itself is worth going into as deep as we can go into it.
And it's one of the key distinctions, of course, between Christianity and secularism. And that was the ultimate critique that you brought home in the commentary, was that regardless of how quantum physics plays into the ultimate question of human freedom and the existence of the mind and so forth, a materialist, a committed materialist, is still in this really awkward spot of saying, well, I believe that my entire existence, including my internal life, my mind, is ultimately determined by either cause and effect going back to the Big Bang following conventional physics, or random quantum events. In neither of those cases can the materialist say, my thoughts are meaningful. what goes on between my ears corresponds in some way to reality. They have absolutely no basis for thinking that. And this was Alvin Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism, that if naturalism is true, you have no reason to think that your monkey mind would come up with a theory that would correctly explain the way the universe actually was and how life came to be, because you didn't evolve to apprehend truth. You evolved to survive. And so for all you know, you're just deluding yourself. And that is ultimately the critique you can level there, and why Christianity offers the only ultimately sound basis for science, because we believe that our minds were created to grasp truth and to be able to observe and draw accurate conclusions about the world around us. So it was a great commentary, and it allowed us an opportunity to dive deeply into these issues on air and here, of course, on the podcast.
So I just want to point out, it is the height of irony that we started with Christmas movies and bad Christmas songs and ended with theories of reliable knowledge.
Yes.
I don't even know what to make of that, but hey, this is BreakPoint.
The longer we go, John, the better it gets. That's the message, because this is a pretty long podcast already.
We get closer and closer to the light as we proceed in the podcast.
Absolutely. One of these days, we'll just have to do a 2-hour podcast and see where we are.
Yeah, we'll be brilliant.
It'll be like an episode of the Joe Rogan Experience by the end of that.
It will just solve world hunger by after 2 hours.
Well, that wraps it up for today, folks. And I'm sure all of you are saying, thank God. Thanks for listening to the BreakPoint podcast. We appreciate it so much. We'll be back next week to answer more of your worldview questions. And if you've got a question, please drop us a message on social media or email us at askthecolsoncenter@colsoncenter.org. And we'd love to engage with it. For John and the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris. We'll see you next time.